Marcus Thompson had always been a patient man, but his new neighbor, Karen Hartwell, was testing the limits of his composure. At 53, he prided himself on the meticulously maintained half-acre lot that had been his sanctuary for the past 20 years. The property wasn't just land to Marcus. It was a living memorial to years of careful cultivation, a testament to his late wife Elizabeth's love of gardening and his own dedication to preserving their shared dream. When the Hartwells moved in 2 summers ago, Marcus had initially welcomed them with a traditional neighborly gesture, a homemade apple pie from the trees Elizabeth had planted decades earlier. Karen had accepted the pie with a perfunctory smile, her eyes already scanning the property with an intensity that made Marcus uncomfortable. Her husband, Tom, seemed pleasant enough, but Karen was a different breed entirely. The first ATV incident happened on a crisp September morning. Marcus was pruning the rose bushes along the eastern fence line when the ear-splitting roar of an engine shattered the tranquil silence. He looked up to see Karen tearing across the property line, her ATV kicking up clouds of dust and leaving deep, ugly trenches in the carefully maintained grass. The machine's massive tires crushed delicate wildflowers that had been Elizabeth's pride and joy, obliterating years of careful cultivation in mere seconds. "Hey," Marcus had shouted, raising his pruning shears in protest. But Karen either didn't hear or didn't care, continuing her reckless path across his property with what seemed like deliberate disregard. What started as occasional tracks quickly became a daily invasion. The deep ruts in his grass grew more pronounced with each passing week. Carefully cultivated flower beds, some containing rare varieties that Elizabeth had collected over years of passionate gardening, were systematically destroyed. The constant roar of the engine became a morning soundtrack, a mechanical assault that destroyed not just his land, but the memories carefully woven into every inch of soil. Marcus began documenting everything. He took photographs of the damage, measured the depth of the ruts, and calculated the destruction. His engineering background, decades spent working as a project manager for a large construction firm, made him meticulous in his approach. Each track, each crushed plant became evidence of a deliberate violation. The local authorities seemed uninterested. "It's a property line dispute," they'd say, best handled between neighbors. The HOA, which Marcus had once believed would protect property values and maintain neighborhood standards, seemed equally indifferent. When he brought his carefully prepared documentation to their monthly meeting, he was met with bureaucratic shrugs and noncommittal responses. But Marcus wasn't the type to give up easily. Elizabeth had always told him that patience was a virtue, but she had also taught him the importance of standing up for what was right. These weren't just tracks in the grass. They were an assault on everything he and Elizabeth had built together. The deep ruts in his grass, the crushed flower beds, and the constant roar of the engine were more than just a nuisance. They were a deliberate provocation. And Marcus was about to prove it. Marcus's first formal approach came on a crisp Saturday morning. He had prepared carefully, printing out property line maps, gathering photographic evidence, and rehearsing a calm, rational speech. Tom Hartwell was working in the front yard, pruning some shrubs, when Marcus walked over with a folder of documentation and a measured demeanor. "Tom," he began, his voice steady, "I'd like to discuss something important about your wife's ATV use." He spread out the photographs, aerial shots from his drone showing the extensive damage to his property, close-ups of crushed flower beds, and detailed measurements of the deep ruts carved into this carefully maintained lawn. Tom looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to another. "I'm not sure what you want me to do," he mumbled, not quite meeting Marcus's eyes. "Karen's been riding those trails for years." "Not on my property, she hasn't," Marcus replied, pointing to the precise property line markings. He explained the ecological damage, the cost of repairs, and the sentimental value of the land. Tom nodded occasionally, but Marcus could see he was more interested in finishing his yard work than addressing the real issue. Later that week, Marcus approached Karen directly. She was unloading groceries, her massive ATV parked conspicuously close to the property line. "Karen," he called out, walking towards her with a folder of documents and a conciliatory smile, "we need to talk about the property line." Karen's response was nothing short of dismissive. She looked him up and down, her designer sunglasses reflecting Marcus' own image back at him. "Are you seriously complaining about a few tire tracks?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. "This is a rural neighborhood. People ride ATVs." Marcus had prepared for this. He showed her the precise measurements, the ecological impact, the property line surveys. "These aren't just tire tracks," he explained. "You're destroying protected wildflower areas, causing significant erosion, and repeatedly trespassing on my property." She laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that seemed to dismiss him entirely. "Tom says you're just a lonely old man with too much time on his hands," Karen retorted. "Maybe you should find a hobby instead of measuring tire tracks." Undeterred, Marcus began to document everything. He installed a series of discrete trail cameras along the property line, capturing time-stamped evidence of Karen's repeated incursions. Each interaction was meticulously recorded: dates, times, conversations, and the extent of the damage. He wrote formal letters, sending certified mail to ensure receipt. Each communication was carefully worded, referencing local ordinances, property laws, and the potential legal consequences of continued trespassing. Marcus highlighted the potential for legal action, hoping the threat would make Karen reconsider her actions. The local sheriff's deputy seemed sympathetic but non-committal. Property line disputes are tricky, he told Marcus during a follow-up visit. Unless there's clear, repeated evidence of intentional damage, it's hard to take action. Marcus knew he was building a case. Each photograph, each documented incident was another piece of a larger puzzle. Karen might think she was winning, might believe she could continue her destructive path, but Marcus was patient. He had learned long ago that sometimes the best strategy was to let your opponent reveal themselves completely. Hoping to resolve the issue amicably, Marcus had exhausted every diplomatic channel. But Karen would listen with a condescending smile, her eyes glazing over before continuing her destructive rides as if nothing had been said. The diplomatic approach was failing, and Marcus was beginning to realize that something more decisive would be necessary. The Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association met on the third Thursday of every month in the community clubhouse, a bland, beige building that always smelled faintly of stale coffee and bureaucratic indifference. Marcus had been a member in good standing for over 2 decades, typically attending meetings sporadically and paying his dues without complaint. This time he arrived early, his meticulously organized folder of evidence tucked under his arm. The documentation was a work of precision: aerial photographs, trail camera stills, GPS tracking of ATV routes, and detailed measurements of property damage. Each page was labeled, dated, and cross-referenced. Margaret Sinclair, the HOA board president, was a longtime friend of the Hartwells. She greeted Marcus with a patronizing smile that immediately set his teeth on edge. "Marcus, what can we help you with today?" she asked, her tone suggesting this was more of a formality than a genuine inquiry. He laid out his evidence systematically. "I'm here to file a formal complaint about repeated property line violations," Marcus began, spreading the photographs across the table. The images were stark: deep ruts cutting through carefully maintained grass, crushed flower beds, and clear evidence of repeated trespassing. Robert Jenkins, another board member, peered at the photographs with feigned interest. "Looks like some tire tracks," he muttered, not bothering to look closely. "These aren't just tire tracks," Marcus explained, his engineering background showing in his methodical presentation. "This is systematic destruction of private property. I've calculated the ecological damage, the cost of repairs, and the potential long-term impact on land stability." Karen's uncle, Harold Hartwell, a board member Marcus had never particularly liked, shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Marcus," he interjected, "Karen's been riding those trails for years. It's not like she's doing any real harm." The meeting quickly devolved into a frustrating dance of deflection. Each time Marcus presented a clear piece of evidence, the board found a way to minimize or dismiss it. They suggested he was being overly sensitive, that ATV use was common in the neighborhood, that he should be more neighborly. "Have you tried talking to Karen?" Margaret asked, as if this were a simple misunderstanding between children rather than a serious property violation. Marcus produced copies of his certified letters, his documented interactions, the photographic evidence of repeated trespassing. "I've exhausted every diplomatic channel," he explained, his patience wearing thin. But the HOA board seemed more interested in maintaining the status quo than addressing a legitimate complaint. Harold Hartwell's connections ran deep. He had been on the board for over a decade, and everyone knew he wielded significant influence. As the meeting concluded, Marcus realized he had hit a wall. The official minutes would reflect nothing of substance, a brief mention of a property dispute with no real action taken. The board's minutes seemed carefully crafted to say everything and nothing simultaneously. Walking out of the clubhouse, Marcus felt the first true stirrings of anger he'd experienced since Elizabeth's passing. This wasn't just about property damage anymore. This was about principle, about respect, about standing up against a system that seemed designed to protect the well-connected rather than address legitimate grievances. The HOA board, it seemed, would be no help. Marcus would need to find another way to protect what was his. The first week of May should have been a time of renewal. Marcus had spent months carefully preparing a section of his lawn for a special memorial garden, a tribute to Elizabeth's love of native wildflowers. He had researched extensively, consulting with local botanists and ecological experts to create a perfect ecosystem that would honor her memory. The seedlings were delicate, carefully selected native species that would take years to fully establish. Some were rare variants that Marcus had tracked down through specialist nurseries, each one chosen with the same meticulous care he had once applied to engineering projects. The ground had been prepared with precision, soil tested, nutrients balanced, drainage carefully considered. It was early Saturday morning when Marcus first noticed something was wrong. The gentle spring sunlight revealed a scene of devastating destruction. Karen's ATV had not just crossed the property line, it had deliberately torn through the carefully prepared memorial garden. The tracks were more than just careless. They were intentional. Deep ruts crisscrossed the newly seeded area, destroying months of careful preparation. Rare seedlings were crushed beyond recovery, the delicate root systems torn apart by massive tired treads. What had taken months of planning was destroyed in minutes. But the garden was only the beginning. The antique fence, a handcrafted marvel built by Marcus's grandfather decades ago, now bore deep gouges and structural damage. This wasn't just a fence. It was a piece of family history constructed by hand during the late 1940s, using techniques passed down through generations. Each wooden slat told a story, each joint a testament to craftsmanship that had long since disappeared from modern construction. Marcus stood frozen, half-empty coffee mugs suspended between his hand and the kitchen window. The devastation before him was complete. Tears welled in his eyes, not from sadness, but from a rising tide of controlled, calculated anger. He began to document everything. Each photograph was taken with the precision of a forensic investigator. Measurements were exact. GPS coordinates were logged. The timestamps on his trail cameras would prove critical. This was no longer just a neighborhood dispute. This was a deliberate act of destruction. Tom Hartwell was in his yard, apparently unaware of the damage his wife had caused. Marcus walked towards him, his movements controlled, his mind racing with possibilities. Years of engineering training had taught him to approach problems systematically, to gather evidence to build a case. "Tom," Marcus called out, his voice calm but laden with a gravity that made Tom look up immediately. "I need to speak with you about your wife's actions." The conversation that followed was brief but pointed. Marcus presented the evidence, photographs, measurements, the extent of the destruction. Tom looked uncomfortable, shuffling his feet, making excuses about not being able to control Karen. But Marcus was done with excuses. The memorial garden, his last project with Elizabeth's memory, had been destroyed. The family heirloom fence lay in ruins. Something fundamental had changed in Marcus that morning. The patient man was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some battles require more than diplomacy. One Saturday morning, the final straw came. Not only had Karen torn up a newly seeded section of Marcus's lawn, but she had also damaged an antique fence his grandfather had built decades ago. The ATV's tracks were deliberate, almost malicious. Marcus realized that conventional methods would never work with someone so intentionally disruptive. The local law library became Marcus's second home. His engineering background had always made him methodical, but now he approached his research with the intensity of a military strategist planning a critical campaign. Each day after his early retirement, he would arrive at the library when it opened, spreading out legal pads, reference books, and meticulously organized digital files. First, he mapped out the precise legal landscape. Property law was a complex ecosystem, and Marcus was determined to understand every nuance. He spoke with retired legal professionals, joined online forums dedicated to property disputes, and consulted with local surveyors who understood the intricacies of land boundaries. His home office transformed into a war room of documentation. One entire wall became a timeline of evidence, color-coded photographs, GPS tracking maps, aerial drone images, and carefully annotated correspondence. Each piece of evidence was cross-referenced, dated, and verified. Trail cameras he had strategically placed captured every incursion with crystal-clear precision. Marcus invested in professional-grade equipment. A high-resolution drone with precise GPS mapping capabilities allowed him to document the exact extent of the property damage. He took multiple angle photographs, created 3D topographical maps of the property, and collected soil samples to demonstrate the ecological impact of Karen's ATV use. He consulted with an ecological expert from the local university, a contact from Elizabeth's gardening network. Together, they quantified the damage to native plant species, calculated the cost of restoration, and documented the long-term environmental impact of repeated ATV crossings. Their report was comprehensive, scientific, and irrefutable. Legal consultations followed. Marcus wasn't wealthy, but he was careful with his retirement savings. He interviewed several attorneys, looking for someone who understood both the legal and technical aspects of his case. He found Maria Rodriguez, a young attorney specializing in property law who was intrigued by the methodical nature of his documentation. "Most people come in with emotional arguments," Maria told him during their first serious consultation. "You've come with a scientific case." Marcus began to understand the legal strategies available to him. Trespass claims, nuisance laws, ecological damage provisions, each avenue was carefully researched and mapped out. He learned about precedent cases, studied local ordinances, and began to build a comprehensive legal strategy. Technology became his ally. He invested in advanced tracking software, created detailed digital logs of every interaction, and developed a comprehensive database of evidence. Each interaction with Karen or the HOA was recorded, transcribed, and analyzed. His background in engineering proved invaluable. Marcus created detailed cost analyses of the damage, not just the immediate destruction, but the long-term ecological and property value impacts. He calculated the cost of restoration, the potential decrease in property value, and the emotional toll of the repeated violations. The local county assessor's office became another resource. Marcus requested historical property records, boundary surveys, and environmental impact assessments. He cross-referenced everything, looking for any potential leverage. By the time he was finished, Marcus had transformed from a frustrated neighbor into a formidable opponent. The timeline of evidence was comprehensive. The documentation was meticulous. Every potential legal argument had been anticipated and countered. Marcus began to realize that this was no longer just about protecting his property. This was about establishing a principle that repeated, intentional destruction would not be tolerated. He was preparing not just for a legal battle, but for a definitive statement about property rights and neighborly respect. The courthouse was an imposing structure of gray stone and polished granite, a temple of bureaucratic justice that seemed to dwarf the personal stories contained within its walls. Marcus arrived precisely 30 minutes before the hearing, his meticulously prepared documents secured in a weathered leather briefcase Elizabeth had gifted him years ago. Maria Rodriguez met him in the hallway, her professional demeanor masking a quiet excitement about the case. "Are you ready?" she asked, reviewing the last-minute details of their strategy. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of legal precision. Each count was carefully constructed, backed by irrefutable evidence. Trespass, property damage, ecological destruction, repeated violations of local ordinances. The complaint was a comprehensive indictment of Karen's behavior. The first hearing was a preliminary matter, but Marcus could see the ripple of discomfort among the Hartwell family. Karen's usual confident demeanor was noticeably subdued. Her uncle Harold, the HOA board member, looked distinctly uncomfortable, unable to make eye contact with Marcus. Maria's opening statement was a clinical dismantling of the Hartwell's potential defenses. She presented the evidence with surgical precision: drone footage showing exact property line violations, expert testimony on ecological damage, detailed cost analyses of restoration, and a comprehensive timeline of repeated trespassing. "This is not about a simple neighborly dispute," Maria argued. "This is about systematic, intentional destruction of private property." The Hartwell's attorney, a portly man with a combative reputation, tried to argue that ATV use was common in the area. But Marcus had anticipated this. Geological surveys, environmental impact statements, and testimony from local conservation experts systematically dismantled that argument. Discovery became a turning point. As part of the legal process, Marcus was able to compel the Hartwells to provide additional documentation. GPS records from Karen's ATV, maintenance logs, communication records, each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of intentional and repeated violations. The ecological expert Marcus had consulted became a star witness. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, no relation to the lawyer, provided a devastating assessment of the environmental damage. Her testimony detailed not just the immediate destruction, but the long-term ecological impact of repeated ATV crossings on native plant species. Financial experts calculated the true cost of the damage. It wasn't just about the immediate destruction. They quantified the long-term property value reduction, the cost of ecological restoration, and the emotional distress caused by repeated violations. Harold Hartwell's influence began to crumble. The HOA board members who had previously protected Karen were now distancing themselves. The carefully constructed network of protection was unraveling under the weight of documented evidence. The turning point came during a deposition. Karen, under oath, made a critical mistake. Her testimony contradicted previous statements, revealing a pattern of deliberate misrepresentation. Each inconsistency was methodically documented, each lie carefully exposed. Marcus watched the proceedings with a sense of calm determination. This was no longer about winning or losing, it was about establishing a principle. The systematic nature of his approach was becoming apparent to everyone in the courtroom. As the legal proceedings progressed, it became clear that this was more than a simple property dispute. It was a comprehensive takedown on the system that had previously allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. Marcus had transformed from a patient neighbor to a methodical adversary, turning each of Karen's actions into a legal vulnerability.